I'm Emma Trimble. This is GBN Originals live from the Art Conference. I'm joined by Ben Jones from the Free Speech Union, and we're going to have a little chat about Islamophobia because this is something that both of us care a lot about. And I know that Free Speech Union has had a lot of experience of issues to do with blasphemy, Islamophobia. So should we just start maybe by taking us through your view of the Islamophobia definition, the recording of Islamophobic non-crime hate incidents, that fact?
With this definition of Islamophobia that, as you know, has come about from the All-Party Parliamentary Group on British Muslims, it really is a minefield for freedom of speech for anybody who wants to talk about Islam, about its history, about its cultural practices, about its record on women's rights, any of these things, because it gives as examples of supposed Islamophobia, in inverted commas, things like talking about or criticising expressions of Muslimness. And so this creates a situation where if this definition were to become law, either through statute or through the back door, through this new Islamophobia council that Angela Rayner has proposed, that perhaps we'll talk about in a moment, were this to become law, we'd be in a situation where somebody, for example, an ex-Muslim woman who's left the religion, would be in trouble, potentially facing criminal charges of some kind of criminal sanction, for talking about the hijab or face veils and for criticising these things because she would be criticising an expression of Muslimness. This definition is full of dangers to freedom of speech like that.
It's not just a sort of Muslim, non-Muslim, white or Muslim, ex-Muslim issue, is it? It's also between Muslim groups. So for the example of the Shia film that some fundamentalist Sunnis tried to close down. Yeah,
that's right. The Lady of Heaven, I think that was called, in Birmingham and a few other places a year or two ago. That's absolutely right. And we've seen in cases like the murder of Assad Shah almost 10 years ago, how dangerous, how lethal this sectarianism between different Muslim sects, denominations can be. And so I think there's all sorts of dangers that this definition can and will be weaponised. It's been adopted by a number of councils, various types of public bodies, but as I said, it's not yet country, UK-wide law. But I think, if you look at, say, another example of a liberal-minded Muslim who wanted to criticise more conservative elements within their own community, again, they would fall foul of this definition because you would be criticising expressions of Muslimness.
So what are those conservative practices? Are you thinking the wearing of the hijab, niqab, that kind of thing?
I think so, particularly if you were talking about modesty standards for women, for example. That's the most palpable expression of Muslimness, I think, that people notice walking down a street here in London or various other parts of the country. And it clearly will inhibit discussion of those sorts of topics, even for people who are from within those communities, much less for the rest of us or anybody else.
Well, within the Free Speech Union, obviously, you've already had some experience of cases that relate to blasphemy and Islamophobia, even before any legal definition has been brought in. How much worse do you think things would get if you did have a legal definition of Islamophobia? And what are the sorts of cases that you're already seeing, even before this definition's been brought?
Well, in the last 2 weeks, there has been this space of copycat Quran burnings after the murder of somebody in Sweden who had burnt a Quran. People have burnt Qurans in solidarity with him as demonstrations. Now, there is no law in this country, as you know, against burning a Quran. This is not a criminal offence. And yet the police and the Crown Prosecution Service have decided to treat it as though it is. And so they are relying on the 1986 Public Order Act, for example, to try and find a way to criminalise people who have burnt the Quran and to prosecute people. Now, we are assisting several such cases right now at the Free Speech Union because we think that this precedent must not stand. We must not be in a position where the police have been, and the CPS, are able to criminalise burning a Quran through the back door. Now, lots of people, of course, will say that burning a Quran is disrespectful and people ought not to do it. And I wouldn't burn any book. I think it is an offensive thing to do. But nonetheless, the most important point here is that there is a fundamental principle in this country that we are allowed to ridicule, mock, and to freely practice our religious beliefs.
Without going into detail, because I know that you can't, are these cases instances of other people who have burned Qurans, or is this other forms of disrespect? So, for example, could it be the case by this definition of Islamophobia that if you were to, never mind burning the Quran, if you were to put a Quran on the floor, which would be regarded as disrespectful in Islam, that a non-Muslim could effectively be held to account to Sharia law, despite the fact that the law of this country doesn't recognise?
I mean, to go back to your previous question about essentially are things bad enough already, even without this definition, there was the case of the schoolboys in Wakefield who lightly scuffed their own copy of the Quran by accident. And in that situation, the police recorded non-prime hate incidents against them. So these will stay on these boys' records unless they are removed. Now, clearly there's no law against lightly scuffing anything. But nonetheless, the police, as I say, are behaving in such a way as to create this precedent, or just getting tighter and tighter, that any disrespect to the Quran, whether you're burning it or accidentally dropping it on the floor or whatever.
And do you ever have cases where, or do you know of any cases where another religious text has been treated similarly by the law? So a Bible or a Torah, for example?
I'm not aware of any. Look, I mean, what I would say is I can imagine a circumstance in which somebody burning a Torah outside a synagogue, for example. Robert Jenrick made this point a couple of days ago. That could be done in such a way as that it would legitimately be a public order offence. Somebody burning a Quran outside a mosque in a way that was suggestive of violence or plausibly stirring up hatred. You know, those could be examples where it might be right that a prosecution would be made. But burning a Quran, or for that matter any religious text, to demonstrate in favour of freedom of speech, where there is no suggestion whatsoever that you are going to commit violence or stir violence up, that is not a criminal act.
Could there reasonably be a presumption that actually, as you say, that there's been this spate of Quran burnings, that actually, far from it being intended to insult Muslims, which is what one of the Islamophobia aspects of the Islamophobia definition is, this idea that criticisms of Islam could be instrumental in marginalising Muslims, and so you can see how Quran burning could be regarded in the same way. Arguably, though, those subsequent Quran burnings should be viewed as an act of protest against arresting people for Quran burnings, rather than the presumption that it's a hate crime.
Yes, I think I'd agree with that. I also think that this reaction from the state and the police and CPS is hugely detrimental to multiculturalism in Britain, which is already in a pretty parlous state, I think it's fair to say. Because England and Wales got rid of our blasphemy laws in 2008. Scotland did a couple of years ago, more recently. There is no blasphemy law in the United Kingdom, and yet now people quite rightly are perceiving that there is a special standard that applies to Islam, that there is a two-tier approach to people's freedom to speak about and ridicule and demonstrate against religion.
What do you think explains that two-tier approach? Because you said that you haven't heard of similar cases with other religious texts. Why is it that the law treats the Quran as if it has a kind of special sacred, even with it as a sacred status, even within British law?
I think that the state, various parts of the state, have decided that the threat of backlash from elements within Muslim communities is so severe that this simply cannot be tolerated. And within law, there's this quaint expression of preserving the tranquility of the kingdom. Now, the trouble is, as the kingdom becomes more and more destabilised in the way in which multiculturalism is being managed, the standard required to maintain that tranquility is going to become tighter and more severe and more censorious, because if the whole country becomes like a tinderbox where the slightest provocation risks sparking serious unrest, as we have seen all too often in the last 12 months alone, the police, the state, CPS and so on are going to take a much more heavy-handed approach. And that's what we're seeing. It's the policing of multiculturalism. It is deeply inimical to freedom of speech for all of us.
There's a zooming out of it, because we're obviously here at the art conference. There's a lot of talk of civilization, shared civilization. How much of an impact, negative impact, presumably, do you see this having on British society more broadly? So we've just seen J.D. Vance giving this speech at the Munich Security Conference, where he very clearly associated censorship with a security risk. So how do you see this in terms of its broader security implications, its broader implications for the culture, the country and society at large?
Well, look, I defend freedom of speech because I think freedom of speech matters. But there's a very strong secondary argument, if you like, from pure power politics, that we ought to defend freedom of speech because the Americans and the new administration quite rightly care about it quite a lot. And it's entirely unreasonable for us to expect, and for Europe to expect, that we can benefit from American security guarantees defending the free world if we are substantially unfree, if our governments are not committed to freedom of expression, freedom of conscience, freedom of religious and philosophical belief, and so on. It's entirely naive for European governments and the British government to think that we can carry on in this incredibly censorious way, prosecuting veterans. We've helped, say, a Royal Marine who was prosecuted for a Facebook video after the Southport attack in which he criticised immigration. The jury took 17 minutes to acquit him. And our state thinks that it can carry on like that and still be part of a free world led by the United States. It's incredible. I mean, it's delusional. It's just not going to fly. It's not going to fly out team.
Thank you so much, Ben Jones from the Free Speech Union. Thank you for watching GB News Originals. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the GB News YouTube channel.